Hello, Moxie.
Hey, Allie. Welcome back.
Thanks. Good to hear you and see you again.
Yeah, it's great to have you on this podcast as our guest today.
Guest slash host.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation because it is a topic very near and dear to my heart and my work, and it is, yeah, a big part of my life. So today we're talking about trauma-informed yoga.
Yes. So, can you tell us how you define trauma-informed yoga, Allie?
Yeah, so I think first it's helpful to just define yoga in general. And I mean, we're both yoga teachers. We've both been teaching for, I've been teaching for 14 years. You've been teaching for how many years, Katie?
About
Moxie?
15.
15, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, we've been both teaching yoga for a really long time, and yoga has been such a central part of both of our lives. And actually, that's how we met.
Mhm.
So, we have that shared passion. And I think for us to understand trauma informed yoga, it's helpful to understand like what yoga is. And I see it as a pathway to union, pathway toward union of mind, body, and soul, pathway toward union of ourselves and the greater universe. Yoga technically does mean to yoke or to bring together. So, really, like yoga is union. Um, and that's how I like to define it. And also, it's important to note that yoga isn't just this physical practice of moving our bodies, it's also a set of principles and guidelines to live by, and also other practices such as mindfulness, meditation, breath work, practices that help us turn inward toward ourselves and kind of disconnect from outside influences to really find that inner connection. So yeah, anything to add to the just the general definition of yoga?
Hmm. I think you did a great job. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would define trauma informed yoga as a way of teaching or practicing yoga that takes into account a person's lived experience. And we can assume there's been some statistics out there that say that 70% of adults have experienced some sort of trauma. So the way I define trauma is it's what happens inside of us when an experience overwhelms our nervous system's capacity to cope. It's not just what happened, but how our body and nervous system learned to survive it. And I believe it was Dr. Bethel van der Kolk who said that trauma is the disease of being unable to be present. So it kind of
Hmm.
strips us of our capacity to stay in the present moment because often those of us who've experienced trauma, the present moment feels too overwhelming to be present in because of the possibility for danger or threat, even if it's not really there. So a lot of times what happens with folks who've experienced trauma is the amygdala, the part of the brain that's responsible for alarming us if there's a threat or danger, it actually becomes enlarged and it literally reshapes our brain and it causes us to be in a state of hypervigilance, if that traumatic experience wasn't metabolized appropriately. And what I mean by that is oftentimes if people have experienced a traumatic event, if their body isn't able to move through the fight, flight, or freeze response, if we weren't able to fight, flight, like fight or get away, or if we didn't have a supportive individual there, our body doesn't know what to do with it. So it stores it in a way that's not adaptive to our current reality. Literally changes our physiology, our brain chemistry, and the orientation of the brain. And it affects every single part of our life. And it makes it really hard to be present with our bodies and present with people around us. So, yeah, trauma really affects us on so many levels. So, back to trauma informed yoga, it's this idea of how do we adapt our teaching to account for the lived experience of those who've experienced trauma? How do we make the practice more approachable, gentler, adaptable for those who find it really hard to be present in their bodies? And there's a lot of different ways that we do that. And I think we'll get into that in a little bit.
I feel like you
Thanks.
gave a really excellent definition of trauma, and especially how it relates to what someone's experience might be in a regular yoga class. Um, what I'm hearing and what you're saying is just how difficult it might be. Somebody who's experienced trauma might hear, oh, go do yoga. That's going to help regulate your nervous system, or this is going to help you heal. But then a lot of people who have experienced trauma enter into a yoga class, and then they sometimes might even question themselves of like, what's wrong with me? Like, why do I feel even worse when I'm in a
Yeah.
yoga class? So I love how you spoke to this aspect of presence, which is such a core foundational principle of the yogic teachings, and
Mm-hmm.
what we're getting at with these practices. So it just feels very inclusive and very kind and loving to be able to take those statistics of, oh, actually 70% of people have or will experience a major traumatic event in their life. So if you look around in the room, 70% of the people in a class
Yeah.
are probably having a really hard time being present.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just really, it's a beautiful approach from what I'm hearing you share. It just seems very, very inclusive. And I feel that the definition of trauma that you offered was a very precise definition of setting the foundation of why this is important.
Absolutely. Yeah. 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 To your point of, people entering just like, an everyday yoga class. And of course, like, yeah, you've experienced trauma and you have a hard time being present, being in your body. You're experiencing anxiety, depression, heightened nervous system states or shutdown states, right? Those are all kind of symptoms of having trauma that's unprocessed. Yeah, yoga gets mentioned a lot. Oh, meditate, do yoga, it'll help. But what a lot of people aren't realizing is how hard it is to actually move through those practices when they are just kind of made for the everyday person without taking into account how hard it might be for someone doing these for the first time. So, as I mentioned, trauma informed yoga is a way of adapting the teachings to support a body who has a hard time feeling present, right? A human who has a hard time feeling present in their bodies and with sensation. So, yeah, we can talk about kind of the core principles of trauma informed yoga and how we adapt the practice to be suitable for all beings. And I think a big piece of that is co-regulation. So our nervous system directly impacts that of another person. And especially when we're in a position of power, so to speak, because we are leading the class, there is some sort of power differential. We have to be aware of how we're showing up. And co-regulation is this idea that like my nervous system is interacting with your nervous system unconsciously. We don't even have to talk about it. We don't even have to know it's happening, but it's happening. It's just like the experience of like going into a room and someone's angry and you can feel it right away. And you're like, oh God, like something doesn't feel right. There's tension in the air, right? That's our nervous systems interacting with one another. So just like you go into a yoga class and perhaps the teacher is, feeling really anxious that day or unsettled, and you can feel that energy. You can feel that unsettledness, even if you can't name it. Someone might be able to attune to that. And the thing about folks who've experienced trauma is their nervous systems are even higher attuned to other people's shifts in their nervous system. Like they learned early on, maybe early on, especially those who've experienced complex trauma, which complex trauma is little, not little, because let me take the word little out of there, but experience of trauma maybe over and over again throughout their lives, like having an abusive parent or partner, and those add up over time. So some people have learned to really track other people's nervous system states. So, us as the teacher, as the space holder, we have to be aware of how we're showing up in this space. This doesn't mean we have to be calm all the time. This doesn't mean we need to be, you know, this peaceful like person every second or even when we walk in, but it does mean that we have a responsibility to show up and hold the space with care and recognize that how we're showing up in the space is going to affect those that we're showing up for. So it's really important for us as space holders, as teachers or therapists, to tend to our boundaries, tend to our energy, tend to our nervous system so that we can show up and be that support and that, anchor for folks who are showing up to take yoga with us. So that's a really big piece of it. Another big piece of it is to remind our students, our participants, our clients of their agency and choice. So a lot of times in yoga, we're giving directives, right? We are directing folks, we're teaching folks through movements or through exercises, right? And it's so important for us to bring down the power dynamic, right? So we can shift the power dynamic by saying, you have choice here. My words are just suggestions. You make the choices. I'll give you options. I'll give you tools. And you try on some of these things if you want to and see what fits. And if it doesn't, that's okay too. So we are helping folks connect with their power through choice. And a lot of times when we've experienced trauma, our choice is taken away, our agency is removed. So in offering that back, reminding them that they have that, they are helping to build that capacity for choice and agency, and they're helping to reestablish that within their own beings, right? Within their own selves. So that's a big part of adapting the yoga practice to suit folks with trauma.
The core principles of trauma-informed yoga are offering agency and choice throughout the class, and also just being aware of our own nervous systems and approaching a class with care, with the awareness and the understanding of how many people have or currently are experiencing and navigating trauma, and how to show up in a way that we are tending to those people with the awareness around that, with tenderness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So those are just kind of like three, right? It's like knowing our responsibility for co-regulation, our nervous system, being aware of how trauma affects the body and the nervous system. And sometimes does take some self-study, right? Or study on its own, like how, I recommend yoga teachers to study trauma and how it affects the body so that you can understand how people might be showing up with this, inability to feel present, and how we can help them increase that ability. So yeah, it's really important to understand the physiology of trauma, how the nervous system is shaped by it. Also, as you mentioned, like the choice and the agency, reminding students and clients and participants of their choice and agency multiple times throughout the class. So yeah, those are three of the core concepts. Of course, there is more to it. I think, another really big piece of it is cultivating an environment of safety. It irks me when people say this is a safe space, because like we can't define that for somebody else. However, we can do certain things to help create an environment of safety, which might be, as someone walks in the door for the yoga class, like showing them where the exits are, showing them where the bathroom is, showing them where they can put their stuff, showing them where they can set their mats down, showing them where the props are, like orienting them to the space, right? I've been to yoga studios where they're just like, oh, hi. and you're
Yeah,
supposed to
that's
walk
it.
in and figure it out for yourself, that feels really unsettling to the nervous
Hmm.
system. We want to give people information, give people the tools that they need to allow their systems to settle
Yeah.
and orient to the space.
Mhm.
Super important. Also, like music plays a big role, right? How we're setting up the space in the beginning of class, for example, like people walking into a completely silent space, that might feel triggering. Or is the music really loud when you walk in? I prefer, I think it's most settling. It might not be for everybody, of course. I think one thing we have to be considerate of is like what works for one person might not work for another. So we kind of have to like give ourselves grace and just do what we can to make the space quote unquote safe. But, for me, it's playing meditative music without lyrics, music that could potentially be soothing to the nervous system with a low BPM, lower beats per minute, lower tempo. And, how is the lighting? Is it really, really bright? That might be overstimulating. Is it too dark? That might be triggering, right? Can we keep the lights at a medium level? Can we minimize scents in the studio so it isn't overwhelming for folks? Because scent is actually can be a trigger for people, because the nerve between the nose and the brainstem is actually the shortest cranial nerve. So that is a really quick way to either soothe someone or trigger someone, because that
Yeah.
is a direct link to the brain, which is a direct link to the nervous system. So, not having overpowering sense. What else can create this environment of safety? Oh, also consent,
Mm.
touch for sure, for adjustments and assists, which is sometimes a big part of the physical practice. So are we giving students an option to opt out of that? I mean, I've absolutely been triggered by touch in a yoga class before, with a teacher not asking me if they could give me an assist, and then pushing my body too far and actually coming out with an injury.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've heard so many stories of
Many
that,
people
which is
have.
just
Yeah.
really sad. So, not to mention, touch is often, can sometimes be part of someone's traumatic event. So,
Right.
absolutely, we have to be conscious of that. So there's lots of
And
different
does that
factors
look
too.
like asking if somebody consents to touch at the beginning of the class? Does that look like asking every time? What does that look like in a trauma-informed yoga class?
That's a great question. I think, you know, if we're teaching in a public space, it might be hard to ask every time. However, I think that asking once isn't enough, because people can change their minds and we have to honor that. They might be okay with it in the beginning and then make a choice halfway through and say, no, I do not want to be touched. So I think asking every time is most important. I think the easiest way to do that is having tokens or cards that people can flip over at any time throughout class.
Mm-hmm.
One side it says, yes, I'm okay with it. The other side says, no, no, thank you. And that way people can make their decision. And that's really important for teachers to explain that at the beginning of class, how those tokens or cards work, so that students can be aware that they have a choice the entire way through. I think that's probably like the best way to do it. But, other people might have other opinions of that, but great question.
Wow, so it seems like there are definitely a lot of really important pieces that I'm hearing that could be brought into a public class.
Yeah.
I think something I'd still like to understand more about is trauma-informed yoga, is that something that is applied in a regular yoga class? Is that something that then somebody becomes trained in trauma-informed yoga and then they only teach trauma-informed yoga classes? I've also heard of trauma-sensitive yoga. Like, how does all this
Yeah.
work with trauma-informed yoga and public classes? Can you tell me a little bit more about the distinctions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think absolutely you can apply trauma informed principles to public classes. I think every yoga teacher should. I really think every yoga teacher should have this training, because it's not included in a regular I mean, it might be included in some regular 200-hour yoga trainings. However, if it wasn't included in yours or in, another teachers, like, I think they should seek that training out. And these are seemingly simple adjustments or adaptations to bring into a public yoga space. Absolutely. And to your question about the trauma informed versus trauma sensitive, you know, from my understanding, trauma sensitive yoga is a framework that helps to treat trauma or that is applied alongside therapy. And it's usually brought in more clinical settings like eating disorder centers or trauma centers or, you know, homeless shelters, places like that. And trauma informed yoga definitely has a lot of similarities to trauma sensitive yoga, but for the way I define it is trauma informed yoga isn't treating trauma. It can be a great complement to trauma therapy, but it's not therapy itself. And that's a really big distinction to make is, you know, us as yoga teachers and therapists have to understand our scope of practice that, you know, we're teaching yoga class, we're not treating trauma. However, we are potentially addressing symptoms of trauma, you know, helping to resolve the inability to be present. We're helping to create capacity around presence, right? Which I think can really help people become more connected to their bodies. And that in itself is such a great tool as you are thinking about trauma healing. So, no, we're not treating trauma in trauma informed yoga. We are adapting the practice to be suitable for folks that have experienced trauma. And we are helping to increase more of like the somatic healing concept of helping people create more of that mind body connection, somatic meaning of the body, right? We're helping people become more attuned to their bodies and creating a relationship with their bodies. So that can be applied really in any setting. And yeah, you can definitely bring more of the trauma informed focus out into some clinical settings as well. Maybe a yoga teacher wants to teach a class to underprivileged kids or to a homeless shelter. It'd be best for them to have that trauma informed training before they go into these communities that have folks who have experienced depression or trauma, you know. So very, very important to add to the toolkit really of any yoga teacher, but especially those that are going out into those more vulnerable populations. Does that clarify?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm gathering from that that any yoga teacher who's teaching in a public space would likely benefit from learning more about trauma informed yoga principles, just teaching to the general population, teaching in public classes. There are a lot of these core principles that they could bring into their teaching that will make their classes more accessible and expanding someone's potential capacity for presence. And especially, this is indicated for people who might want to be teaching in certain populations that have experienced systemic oppression or
Yeah,
yeah, are just generally more exposed to traumatic experiences.
absolutely. And not to mention, like maybe there's therapists or clinicians or social workers that want to bring more body based principles or body based approaches to their work, their scope of practice. Like
Mm-hmm.
trauma informed yoga could be something that they study to bring in some breathing techniques or to bring in some meditation techniques in a trauma informed way, because as we mentioned, those are all yoga too, into their clinical scope. So I think, you know, it can go beyond just yoga teachers. It could be, you know, directors of nonprofits or social workers, therapists, clinicians, even body workers that might want to bring some of these principles or approaches into their work. So I think it can go beyond just the yoga space too.
Oh wow, that's a great point. Yeah, so many different types of therapists, whether you're a massage therapist or what have you, that are holding space for people who are likely coming in with difficult experiences. And
Yeah.
yeah, that this could be applied much further beyond yoga. It seems like this is what you're talking about is also just trauma informed principles for holding space in general.
Mm-hmm,
Mhm.
hmm. Yeah, especially if we're bringing in like meditation or breath work or any sort of movement. Absolutely. Like, yeah, the trauma informed principles can be applied.
You're reminding me of when I was in my therapy training, and it's so common nowadays to bring mindfulness practices into
Yeah.
therapy. And I remember a lot of my colleagues had no background
Yeah.
in yoga or teaching meditation, and that was just very difficult to find. It's difficult to find the words. I mean, we've been doing teacher
Hmm.
trainings for a while. It's difficult to know what to say, and then also to incorporate these aspects of being trauma informed in a therapeutic space is
Hmm.
really not easy. So I definitely feel firsthand the importance of what you're speaking to, of how important it is to be trained in these things as to not cause harm, to mitigate harm as
Yeah.
much as possible. Um,
Absolutely. 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 Language, like our language, our words have power. So a big aspect of trauma informed yoga also is adapting the words that we speak, the language that we speak. I hear in a lot of yoga classes, oh, just close your eyes. That can be really triggering for people. So giving options like close your eyes or find a soft gaze in front of you, or close your eyes or keep them open, right? Also, another aspect of that is like breath is a big part of yoga. Sometimes breath is really triggering for people. So now I always mention in my classes, if it feels okay to focus on the breath, join me in this exercise or something like that, right?
mhm.
So I'm giving people an opt out. If you don't want to focus on your breath right now, you might notice the ground underneath you, right? So, like, you see how these shifts in language can help people feel at ease, can offer people that choice back to them of, like, actually, no, I don't want to focus on my breath today.
Mhm.
Thanks for giving me the option to not. So there's so many ways that our language can empower people or potentially, I hate to use the word harm, but potentially harm people, right? And this leads into my story of I have a couple different stories of being triggered in yoga classes, unfortunately. Yeah, I had a flashback of a traumatic event. It dropped me down to my knees and I spent the rest of the class in child's pose crying. Um, it helped me see how much our words matter. And it also helped me see how what happened to us seemingly years ago can still live in our body, right? And we can be triggered seemingly by simple things. So my personal experience really influenced the way that I held space moving forward and helped me, realize that I wanted to step on the path of learning more about understanding my own physiology from trauma and also how I can be a space holder who understands, how my language might impact another. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for so vulnerably sharing that story. And I have a lot of questions around that. One being, I think what you're helping me see right now is I noticed in my system when you were talking about all the core principles that I started to feel intimidated, intimidated and
Yeah.
overwhelmed, and kind of like, whoa, like this is a lot to think about. This seems like a lot of a responsibility for a yoga teacher. Maybe
Hmm.
if somebody's listening to this and they just did their 200 hour and and now they're scared. Now they're
Yeah. That they're
scared
going
to
to
teach yoga
traumatize
because
someone
they're
or trigger
scared they're going to
someone.
traumatize someone or they're going to trigger
Yeah.
someone. So
Yeah. It's so
what do
real.
you have to say to maybe the person that's hearing this and is feeling scared or overwhelmed?
Yeah. Yeah. Great, great question. There's no foolproof formula. There's no guarantee that we're going to or not going to trigger someone. Your best is enough. Like you just listening to this episode and maybe taking a couple little tidbits, that's enough, honestly, if that's where you're starting, right? Ultimately, yes, we have a responsibility to take into account how we're holding space. And it's not our responsibility to track or be responsible for every person's trauma or trigger. We can't. We absolutely can't. I have still triggered people. I have still made mistakes. Every mistake that I've made has been a learning experience. We have to give ourselves grace and just do the best we can. And honestly, if we're showing up with care and tenderness, that's enough. I guarantee folks can feel that. They can feel your care. And that above all is enough. And if, this is speaking to you and you're like, oh, I really do want to learn more and I am feeling intimidated or overwhelmed, you know, you can learn more about this to help you understand these concepts further. There are resources out there to help you, strengthen your toolkit. And ultimately, again, what folks walk in with is their responsibility as well, right? So we can't hold everything for everybody. We have to really hold ourselves with tenderness and care as well. So I think that also speaks to our scope of practice, realizing that, I am a therapist, but a yoga teacher isn't a therapist, most likely. Sometimes they are both. However, if you're a yoga teacher and you're not a therapist, name that, remind yourself of that. And perhaps if you see someone struggling in your class, you can go up to them after and you can offer them, your care without taking on their story, without feeling like you have to fix, without feeling like you have to heal them. You can offer them a therapist resource. You can, let them know about ways to find therapists in their area if they need it. So you don't have to hold all of that. It's not your responsibility to hold all of it. Ultimately, if you're teaching a public yoga class, you're going to have a full gamut of people that come through and you won't know what people are holding. You can only just do your best to hold space with care and tenderness. And like I said, that's enough. So hopefully that eases some of that intimidation and worry that you're doing great just as you are. Just by listening, just by being here, that's enough.
Thank you for saying all those words. I feel even in my system just a deep relaxation of, yeah, just do the best. You're doing the best that you can and just offer care. The other question that I have around the story that you told is, say, for example, well, it's a twofold question. One part of that being, how might a yoga teacher tell the difference between if they have triggered someone in class by their words versus like if somebody's like in pigeon pose and they're releasing some emotion and they're crying.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it a yoga teacher's responsibility to come up to that student during class? Do you leave them in their process? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially if you don't have therapy training, you might not know what's happening for a student. If somebody was crying, say in pigeon pose, and they had their token or card flipped up of saying, yes, I would appreciate hands on, I might go and just place a hand on their back and just offer like a loving touch in that moment. I wouldn't be pushing them deeper into the pose. I would just be offering them like a hand on their shoulder. Or maybe I would bring a box of tissues and just place it right next to them. That would be a way that I would show care and support. How to tell if someone's triggered, you might not know. You might not know. If somebody is, rushing out of class and seeming really distraught after class, I might go up and just be like, hey, like, I'm here. Is everything okay? Or is there anything I can support you with in this moment? Again, without taking on the responsibility of their emotions, just like holding a little bit of extra space. If you have that, you might not have it. There might be 20 people leaving your class and you're not even able to catch them. And in that, if you, want to follow up via an email or a text, like if you have a personal relationship with them or not, that's your choice. Also, we need to be respectful of our boundaries as the teacher. That A, we aren't their therapist in that moment. B, do we have the capacity to reach out and offer more care? So it takes a lot of discernment in those moments of, you know, really trusting what your gut is saying. My gut saying go and support that person by putting a hand, I'm
Mm,
going to go do that if they are allowed, if they're open to it.
mm.
If my gut's saying give them space, I'm going to give them space. And sometimes we don't know. We don't know what to do. And that's okay too. That's okay too. These are hard situations to deal with, especially if you don't have the trauma informed background or the therapist training, right? It's tough for yoga teachers to know, to have that discernment. So
Yeah.
give yourself grace. Give yourself grace in those moments.
It's a beautiful example and wonderful clarity around the distinction and really listening to ourselves as
Yeah.
well, the trust in our own intuition in those moments.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Allie, why is the nervous system such a central focus on how trauma shows up in the body? Why is the nervous system like this big thing that people talk about with trauma? And what does it do
Yeah.
have to do with trauma informed yoga?
Yeah. Good question. It's central because the nervous system stores our experiences, right? And is adapted to our past experiences, especially if they were imprinted as traumatic. So the nervous system has these automatic responses, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. And our tendency to move into those responses is typically dependent on threat, but sometimes if we've experienced trauma, the threat isn't there. You know, it might be a text and from our boss and we freeze up, right? Or we get anxiety. We start to feel our chest racing or palms sweaty, even though it's might not be a real threat. So it's kind of like our brain, which is intimately connected to the nervous system, is responding to threats that aren't there if we've experienced trauma. So as I mentioned before, like the amygdala actually gets larger. However, a beautiful thing is the nervous system is adaptable. The brain is malleable. It can change. And through these mind body practices, we call them body ground up practices, right? Where we're working with the body to find regulation in the nervous system. Our nervous system can respond more easily to safety the more times that we're able to experience it. Safety, that is, through finding choice in our bodies or choice in our movements through the yoga practice, or feeling supported by a regulated individual, by being able to tune into our breath and presence more deeply, right? So, yoga gives us an opportunity to expand our capacity for these regulated nervous system states that sometimes didn't feel safe to be in, because what if a threat happens, right? So we are retraining our brain, we're retraining our nervous system through the practice of yoga. And one beautiful thing about trauma informed yoga, specifically the method that I teach, is we have a framework for the entire arc of the practice. And the way we sequence our classes is based on the nervous system.
Oh,
I don't teach to a
beautiful.
peak pose. I don't teach to one body part or one, like, I don't just center it around the hips, or back bends. I'm teaching a yoga class to the entire system, to the entire nervous system and the fascia, which is connected to the nervous system. So there's a framework involved that helps our bodies, our nervous systems move through the nervous system states in a really contained way, and ideally ends in a parasympathetic state, or the balanced state of the nervous system, where we're able to find a pocket of rest, even if it's only for a moment, right? A pocket of clarity, of compassion for ourselves, and we find that in that window of regulation, or that window of yoga, where we're able to have capacity for the present, right? We're able to come back to that presence. So yeah, it's really beautiful how we can use yoga as a tool to shape the nervous system and balance and support it.
So I heard you say the window of yoga. That sounds to
Yeah.
me very much like the window of tolerance. You're speaking about expanding our capacity for presence. It's sounding a
Yeah.
lot like expanding our window of tolerance.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you would also say is similar with the nervous system work with yoga.
Yeah, yeah. We've talked about this in past episodes. Yeah, the window of tolerance. And actually I saw a post on Instagram today that was like, forget the window of tolerance. It should be the window of choice. Because to tolerate something
Mm.
means that maybe we're not in agreement with it.
Oof. Yeah.
So changing our language a little bit around that, more of like a
Decolonized.
decolonized, thank you, lens of it, where, yeah, we're not just tolerating life, we want to expand our capacity
Mm.
for all of our states, really. So being in the window of tolerance or the window of choice or the window of yoga, whatever you want to call it, doesn't mean that we're just calm all the time. It does mean that we can move through all of our experiences,
Hmm.
all of our emotions from a place of having capacity for it. Because maybe in the past, anger felt like way too much.
Yeah.
I can't do it. We shut down, right? Or it's way too much, too high rage. So how can we still stay in that window with honoring all of our emotions, with having capacity for, standing up to what's right or enacting change, especially in this time
Mm, I love that.
period that we're living in right now, which is another piece I wanted to talk about today is like, why is this important right now?
Hmm.
And like, we're moving through political turmoil right now. There's a lot of people suffering right now, and people are holding more stress than ever. Mental health is at its worst. So, this work is important now more than ever because our work is helping to expand that capacity for standing up for what's right, for holding boundaries, for protecting our energy, not so we can just stick our heads in the sand, but so we can show up more fully to parent our kids, do the work in the world, to cope with the stressors of today, to, um, you know, really, really live in this day and age of extreme stress. So yeah, it's so important right now, which is why I founded Yoga for the Times and Yoga and Therapy for the Times, because these times are asking more of us. And how can we show up fully in them? So
Wow,
yeah,
beautifully stated. And
thank you.
yeah, you are very much responding to the call of the times with the work that you're offering, Ali. And how can people work with you?
Yeah. So I kind of have two umbrellas of my business. One is Yoga for the Times, the other is Therapy for the Times. And in the Yoga for the Times umbrella, I am offering a trauma informed yoga certification course. And it's a 25-hour course. It's eligible for Yoga Alliance continuing education credits, hopefully mental health continuing ed credits down the road. And it's really made for yoga teachers, clinicians, social workers, any type of space holder who wants to expand their knowledge around this specific topic. There's really no prior training required, just in a willingness to learn and unlearn and
Mm.
adopt these principles into their scope of practice. So, really looking forward to this training. It's something that's super near and dear to my heart and my work, and something that's been evolving over the past 14 years. So yeah, yogaforthetimes.com is the website where you can find information on that. Also, my Instagram at Yoga for the Times. I also offer somatic trauma therapy and EMDR under the Therapy for the Times umbrella, and that's more individualized trauma work. We also incorporate trauma informed yoga into that work. I offer a lot of yoga in the beginning and end of our trauma work to help the
Mm.
nervous system recalibrate and come back into balance before we step back out into the world. So, yeah, it's an integral part of my work. And yeah, I'd love to have anybody join me who's interested in learning more.
Well, thank you so much, Ali,
Thank
for
you.
hosting and joining us as our guest today. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Moxie.